general, what I'd like to ask, will an increase in the minimum wage spur companies to increase productivity by whatever means they can? And would that generally nudge up the nation's productivity, and is that good for us?
Most of us are business people that are standing here this afternoon. All of us will tell you, if you use the Costco example, employee productivity, reduced hiring and reduced training costs are material for Costco. And if you look closely at the Walmart comparison, with their very high turnover as they keep at the very low wage, their productivity per employee is measurably much less. Their hiring costs are immeasurably higher, and their training costs similarly so. Every business person up here will tell you that a stable, fairly compensated workforce can be proven to be a plus in very significant ways.
Leo is absolutely right, but there's studies that go back decades that have established the productivity effect of raising the wages for low wage workers. As a matter of fact, Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, one of the areas that he worked in, which was recognized by the Nobel Committee, was in the area of labor productivity of low wage workers from increases in the minimum wage. And also Janet Yellen, the current head of the Federal Reserve, and her husband, who's a very prominent economist, both have published extensively on this subject along the lines of what Leo has said.
And I would add to that it's common sense. If you're someone who's earning the minimum wage, what is the share of mind that you're spending worrying about just paying your bills? And if you didn't have quite as many worries about being able to pay your bills, pay your rent, pay your child care provider, how much more share of mind can you give your employer, and what's the benefit to the employer? I think it's a very, very straightforward argument. Anyone who understands business would tell you that a better paid workforce is a more productive workforce.
Those are very nebulous arguments. Can you point to anyone saying, well, if my labor costs are higher, I'm going to invest in better technology and such like?
There's a new study out from the Chicago Fed.
This is Steve Roth.
Steve Roth, R-O-T-H, that says that when it compared counties across state lines, which had different minimum wage things. And what they found was that in the higher minimum wage counties, you saw companies emerging that were more efficient and more productive, and actually displacing businesses that rather relied on the company dole, the government dole, to make themselves profitable. So anybody who believes in creative destruction should be very much in favor of this program.
It's not so much the increased capital spending by companies who raise the rate, okay? It's not so much increased capital spending or new technology. It's what Leo described, the benefits that are accrue from raising the wages on the lower workers in terms of retention of the workforce, the costs of training and retraining workers. That's where the productivity increases come into.
So 2 points that I think your question touches on. The first is that if you look back historically, there have been massive increases in productivity that affect this sector of the labor force where they haven't benefited from that increase in productivity, on the one hand. And on the other hand, my job is that I'm a venture capitalist. Looking forward, the effect of the new technologies that are coming are going to dramatically increase the productivity of the economy. And what we need to do is figure out how to recut the deal with folks who are working in the service sector. So this is a big problem going forward, and this change in the minimum wage is a modest first step to addressing it.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious about what you're hearing and what your sense is as to whether or not this federal minimum wage law is likely to pass. I understand it's going to be voted on in early March, and I'm curious, especially in light of the Senate not being able to pass this unemployment extension recently, whether you think it's likely that minimum wage.
I don't think you know yet.
I was going to say, let me take that if you don't mind. Leo, I think the reason that these folks are here and the reason 100 other people are standing behind them is that we're going to make sure that law gets passed in March. So they're going to do
Let me tell you
everything
about
that
the
they can do.
probability. There are two organizations that are standing against it. Parts of the fast food industry and parts of the low-end retailing industry. If there's breakage with the rest of the big business community, which tends to be all for one and one for all, then it will pass. Most business people, 75+%, will take you where Ron was trying to take you on uns, which is they believe in this outcome. There is a tendency in this town for the trade associations, particularly the National Chamber, to vote as a unit. And so you're going to have to see some breakage there. There's only two organizations that are spending money in opposition. It's low-end fast food and low-end retailing.
And just to add, I think a point we want to that should be emphasized is that if you're a Republican, this is just corporate welfare that's happening right here. These people's lives are being subsidized by taxpayer dollars through programs that exist because the companies are not paying their workers a fair wage. So if you're on the Republican side of the aisle, you should be in favor of this. And if you're on the Democratic side of the aisle, you should be in favor of this. There's very few arguments that you can make to why this isn't a fair and just way to do things in this economy, but also the right thing to do from whatever perspective you come from.
Well, one thing I'd like to add to that, which really is very ironic as somebody like myself from a conservative background, is that the major Republican or conservative Republican response to these calls for a much higher minimum wage has been calls to increase welfare spending and use that as the solution to poverty. In other words, the earned income tax credit checks are simply the government sending checks, sending money to people because they're poor to make them somewhat less poor. That is the proposal that Marco Rubio and a lot of the point people on the Republican side are making, that the way to solve poverty is to increase welfare spending. And that is not a traditional Republican conservative argument. And in fact, Martin Feldstein in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago explicitly called for merging together wages and welfare into a single system. And that is not something that I think a lot of conservatives should be comfortable with. And it shows how the lobbyists have come to dominate that side of the aisle rather than people who are principled, ideologically committed to small government.
A statistic that would be helpful perhaps to your story, the McDonald's Corporation, the employees of the McDonald's Corporation receive something around $1.2 billion a year in state assistance across the country, which is the point that Ron is making. That's $1.2 billion because they pay low wages that their women and men receive instead from the state in which they're employed. It is corporate subsidy to one of the wealthiest, largest corporations in America from the taxpayers. And Ron, why don't you elaborate on that just a bit?
I mean, it's entirely true. I mean, in other words, businesses classically would prefer to have somebody else cover their costs. I mean, it's a problem. No, it's a problem in any free market economy. You hire lobbyists and you try to get government subsidies. What we have is $250 billion a year in social welfare subsidies going to these corporations and these businesses. And I think it makes much more sense for the businesses to be forced to pay their own workers rather than shifting the cost to the taxpayer. And that is not anything that conservatives should be reluctant in supporting. I mean, a lot of it, again, is that conservatives have not focused on this issue that much for decades. They haven't really thought about it much. And when you frame it in the right way, you know, as I've been noticing, you get suddenly a light goes off in their head and they look at the issue in an entirely different light. And I think there's a good chance there may be a broader ideological coalition on this than people would imagine.
But if it's being driven by a lot of nationwide businesses, why has it been easier to get minimum wage increase at the state and local level?
Well, again, it depends. Particular states, for example, might be sufficiently under the control, say, of the Democratic Party, which would be relatively immune to these types of lobbyists. But, you know, again, it's difficult, and that's actually one reason why I'm pushing forward an initiative in California that circumvents the state legislature, that circumvents the lobbyists, and will simply put it on the ballot and raise the California minimum wage at $12 an hour. I mean, basically, something like that would save American taxpayers billions of dollars a year. And the notion of conservatives being opposed to saving the taxpayers money is not something conservatives should take a stand.
I'd like to add something to it because you asked a political question. And you been getting a bunch of economic answers. The political question in my mind is, this is an issue of fairness. The plurality of the people that are working on minimum wage today in America are single mothers. That's a scary thought. However, there's more power in those ladies as a political force than one would expect. And there is something called an election coming up, and the support for people who are against this will melt as the support for people who are for it will raise. And I would expect that this will be less of a partisan issue and more of a I want to get reelected or elected issue.
But the key to that, Woody, is that the truth gets out. There's a lot of argument out there that is not based on fact, that is being used by those who oppose it to seem principled when in fact they're not principled. The fact of the matter is that, you know, 1 out of 2, more than 1 out of 2, McDonald's workers' families are on public assistance. The fact of the matter is that 88% of the people that are being paid minimum wage are not teenagers, they're adults over the age of 20. The average age is 35. More than a quarter of them are parents. These facts need to get out, and the noise machine that makes it very difficult for Americans to hear the facts needs to be muted, and that's very difficult to do.
We're going to win this.
And I think that's the other point. I think there's one more point to this, which is there's a lot of corporate advocacy couched as economic theory coming from the Republican Party that's really subsidies for corporations and corporate welfare. This is like an economic third rail, because if you really want to take a stand against this increase in the minimum wage, then as people learn about this issue, you're going to be exposed to actually who you're working for. And it's not your constituents, it's not the people that live in your district, it's the people that are donating to your campaign. And I don't think that people are ready to peel back that veil, so I don't think that there's going to be a lot of strong opposition here.
Just to be clear, that's Rick Schottenfeld, who is a Republican. So thank you for giving us that. Go ahead.
Question, what are you doing to make it easier for Republicans to sign off on a bill they would not terribly oppose? I would note you seem to have very few Republicans here. You seem to be unfamiliar with Republicans, that you have to have your House a Republican. I would note also you're going to the White House, which will allow the president to claim credit for this idea and thus will push the Republicans away from this idea. So what are you doing politically that's clever to match smart capitalists to actually make it easier for Republicans to sign off on this?
We're being patriots, and we're asking them to do the same thing. I mean, this is a simple patriotic argument. This is not about Republicans or Democrats. It shouldn't be. Just because the president's for it doesn't mean it's wrong. Just because there are some Republicans that oppose it doesn't mean it's right. People should just vote their conscience on this.
Our support gives them political cover, however little.
And I think, listen, this country is divided. There's clearly a divided country in terms of what people think they should be, the country should be doing. But the fact is that because the country's divided doesn't mean we should do nothing. It means we should compromise. And so we have a group of Democrats and Republicans up here, and we're all supporting this bill, and we all believe it's sound economics. I think it's morally sound, and we think it's good for the country. There's a lot of other things that could be done, and this is a great first step.
The ideological divide is not nearly as sharp as you might imagine. For example, a few months ago, one of the leading economics writers for National Review specifically came out and endorsed a $12 an hour minimum wage. A few weeks ago, the Daily Caller, which is one of the most widely read publications, came out with a blistering 2,500-word article touting all the important reasons why Republicans and conservatives should support a much higher minimum wage. We have Phyllis Schlafly in her column a few weeks ago endorsing a higher minimum wage. Bill O'Reilly, one of the biggest conservatives on TV, coming out in favor of the $10 minimum wage. I mean, a lot more of these people, once they start looking at the facts and investigating the reality, are moving into that camp.
And this is not about left and right. This is and Democrat and Republican. It's really about how much power the lobbyists have.
Yeah, exactly.
The lobbyists of two industries have.
I did run a small business. I'm now lucky enough to call myself a philanthropist, and there's really no amount of philanthropic money that can make up for what the government should be doing. I think both Republicans and Democrats need to go back and read the preamble to the Constitution, where it says We need to provide for the general good. Also, we all need to look at the fact of our own, everybody's self-interest is in this in terms of where we're living. I live in an affluent community. I'm surrounded by Oakland. Crime is very high. I know that more employment will reduce the crime rate, and that's really in everybody's self-interest too.
Lauren Windsor with the Undercurrent, Young Turks. You mentioned that it was more of a patriotic issue, but isn't it also just on the basis of free market economics, more free market? I mean, you would have the argument of, you know, you shouldn't set regulations, set a price floor for labor because it will cause jobs to go overseas, but don't you think that it's more free market in that you're taking all of these people off of subsidies, corporate welfare? Like, which one is the...
Look, the role of government is not to set the, is to set a foundation, right? So this is a foundational issue, and we know that capitalism works best when everyone understands the rules of the road. What we've got over here right now is we've got certain sectors of the economy that are essentially privatizing profits, socializing costs, and that's not fair. It's not fair to other businesses that are not doing that, either because the cost of our labor, I'm in the technology sector, I don't have anybody on my staff down to the people that answer the phone that make less than $16 an hour, and I couldn't possibly benefit from it, and that's not the reason I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it because it's wrong. And there are certain sectors of the economy that are benefiting from opportunities that are afforded to them by frankly, their lobbying, and we are here to say it's wrong. It's not an issue of left or right, it's an issue of right. What's right and what's wrong.
But
There's another question. Can we afford it? We're talking about $10 an hour. We just spent a month in Australia, and before that we were in New Zealand. Those two countries have $15 an hour minimum wages. They're very prosperous. Their total wealth as a country certainly is not more than America, but they're prosperous, and they got through the Great Recession much more strongly than America did, despite their $15 an hour minimum wage. So that high minimum wage, much higher than anybody is proposing here today, has contributed to their economy, not undermined it.
And Guy, did you see a McDonald's while you were in New Zealand?
We did,
yes. and were they boarded up and closed?
They were selling burgers.
They were doing well. Were they doing okay?
But the economic efficiency argument, which I think is what you addressed, okay?
May I clarify that?
Yes.
For all of the Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman junkies of the world, is it a greater sin to institute a price floor for labor, or to, enable workers to get off, or corporations rather, to get off of the government
It's
goal?
the latter, because if you look at it from, and economists have looked at this for decades, the wages of low-wage workers are artificially depressed. They're being subsidized. Their employers are being subsidized by the government, and that is artificially depressing wages. So if you want the market to be more efficient, there's no such thing as a perfectly efficient market, but if you wanted the market to be more efficient, you would end the subsidies and raise the minimum wage. That would
But if Ayn Rand was here, what she would look at was simply the comparison of Costco to Walmart. Costco, its employees receive no subsidy from the states in which it's located because its minimum wage is $12. Yet we know that half of Walmart's employees receive some form of state assistance. And that is the single comparison that an Ayn Rand or a free marketer would make, is company by company, exact same industry doing exactly the same thing, and one is subsidized by all of us and the government indirectly, and one is not. That's not a free market.
You all say this won't have any impact on employment, but there's various efforts in Congress to sharply increase the influx of low-wage labor in the country, 20 million according to the recent Senate bill, over the next 10 years. How can you keep unemployment down if you're simultaneously increasing the inflow of low-skilled laborers and putting a $12 cap, $10 minimum wage?
There are so many different aspects to a higher minimum wage that a stroke would solve different problems. Obviously, the ones we've been talking about in terms of wealth and poverty, in terms of low-wage workforce. The Social Security system, for example, since taxes low-wage thing. A much higher minimum wage would at a stroke add billions of dollars a year to Social Security, would at least help to stabilize the system going forward. Another aspect is the immigration issue. In other words, we've had numerous battles over the last 10 or 15 years over the question of immigration, and in particular, illegal immigration. Now, the situation is very simple. The reason 11 or 12 million illegal immigrants have come to the United States is they've come here for jobs. The reason they get those jobs is that they're the only people willing to work for such low wages, $7.25 an hour, $8 an hour in California. Most Americans are very reluctant to take that sort of job. If you raise the minimum wage to a much more reasonable level, like $10 or even $12 an hour, suddenly Americans would be much more able to take that job. And the pressure on employers to hire people who are here illegally would diminish, because they would basically have other people willing to work at that. And right now, if somebody refuses to hire illegal labor, he's tremendously under-competitive compared to those companies that do. Well, if you raise the minimum wage, it solves that problem. So I'm not saying a much higher minimum wage would entirely solve the illegal immigration problem, but would greatly reduce the problem.
More people means a bigger economy. If we had 350 million people instead of 330 million people, we'd have a commensurately bigger economy, no matter what the minimum wage.
Through my business, I speak to CEOs of companies all the time, and the thing they mostly complain about is a lack of customers. And the reason why there's a tremendous amount of capital that's been created by quantitative easing, and there's a lot of capital looking for return that's parked in treasuries paying 2%. That money is available. There's plenty of capital formation. We need more consumption in this economy. And the gap between CEO pay and employee pay has never been wider. The average CEO in the United States makes 395 times what his average worker makes. That's compared to ratios of 20 to 1 in most of the European countries and the rest of the world. It's compared to a ratio of 20 to 1 in the United States in the 1980s and late 70s. It's become out of whack, and that's why there's no consumption, because you can't have capital formation without consumption, and so when the people on the right say, you give the money to the people at the top, you form capital. Yes, that money's available to start businesses, but those businesses need customers. And so we've had a system where you're either here or you're there. But what makes an economy work is both. You need both ends of the spectrum doing well, and that's when the strongest periods of growth in this country have been. That's when we've created the most jobs. And it's completely out of whack right now.
You look at immigration, and you look at immigration during the time that our economy was suffering, we actually had net immigration loss. People were not actually coming in here because there were no jobs. The same will apply. If the jobs are being taken by Americans, and there will be fewer jobs for illegal immigrants. By the way, for the record, I came here as an illegal immigrant when I was 12 years old, so I know what I speak about a little bit. Guess what? Less foreigners would come here who are low-skilled, who would qualify for those jobs, and we would be able to bring on foreigners that, quite frankly, are the ones we want to bring into the country, the ones that are better educated and can help propel our economy.
Undercurrent under the surface makes the mainstream get so nervous. It's time for purpose, for news to serve us, not with propaganda they use to hurt